you probably saw this back in 2022, but Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre made headlines saying that he thought that the governor of the Bank of Canada, the organization that makes decisions that impact every single Canadian, should be fired, especially given this situation where we're seeing high interest rates and record high inflation. But in a recent interview that kind of flew under the radar because it was during the holidays, Pierre Poilievre gave us more insight on what exactly this means and his current views on what he sees as a disastrous mistake made by both the Bank of Canada and the Trudeau government, and he uses some shocking data to make these points. So let's listen in on what was just said and talk about how it could impact you directly in the interesting way that today's situation actually maps to the 70s and 80s in Canada and the potential solution to this affordability and cost of living crisis that we're currently dealing with here in Canada.
I want to essentially do a follow-up on central bank governors. The last time a prime minister declined to renew the mandate of a central bank governor, it was John Crow, who had been running, it was a Liberal who declined to renew John Crow's mandate. He'd been running a high interest rate policy to fight inflation. Was that a good policy, and would you be in the market for someone who had the same philosophy as John Crow?
You're asking me if John Crow's interest rate policy was the right one. I don't know if it was the right one or not. But I do know that it was the same problem that got the country in the mistake, and we got into the same mess then that we're in now for the exact same reasons. So we had a Trudeau as a prime minister who ran monstrous deficits, dramatically increased the money supply to pay for it. That delivered 12% year-over-year inflation, and then the central bank had to raise interest rates. I think mortgage rates reached nearly 20% as a result. You can debate the interest rate policies later on, but the real problem happens when you create all the cash and run all the inflationary deficits that cause the inflation in the first place. And that's what we have to reverse. You know, here in Canada, we had a 20% increase in the money supply in 2 years. That's the biggest single increase in money supply, M2 money supply, since the last Trudeau.
So some interesting points there. He compares the period in the 70s and 80s when we saw really high inflation with the period we're seeing today. And we're going to take a look at some of that data, and you really need to pay attention to these three indicators that we're going to talk about: Canada's money supply growth, as well as Canadian government debt and how that impacts inflation. First, we're going to talk about the period of time when we saw high inflation back when Trudeau Sr. was in power in the late 1960s leading up to the early 1980s. And we're going to talk about how these three economic indicators layer over top of each other and interact in ways that you might not expect. First, we're looking at Canada's money supply. This is its M2. This is a tracking of how much money there is in the Canadian financial system, and doesn't just include cash and bills that are actually in circulation, but it also includes deposits at individual banks. You might know that there's more deposits in banks than there actually is circulating money, so this sort of tracks all of that sort of debt and loans and the holdings at banks. Now, during the time that Trudeau Sr. was in power from 1968 to 1984, we saw a dramatic increase in the money supply in Canada. It started around $25 billion and grew by 1984 to $175 billion. Now, this is a 700% increase. You might think we're looking at the same chart here, but this is actually a different chart now, and this is tracking Canadian government debt and how it has increased over time, and it corresponds pretty tightly to the increase of the money supply from 1968 to 1984, going from, again, just under 25 billion to over 150 billion in Canada. And during that exact same period of time, when we look at the Canadian inflation rate, we see two different peaks here of over 12% inflation in Canada at the same time when the money supply is expanding and government debt is expanding. Now, as a quick aside, I think it's really interesting to look at these sort of twin peaks of inflation that we saw in Canada in the 70s and 80s and talk about how that can impact the Bank of Canada's decisions today and how it sort of shows what the Bank of Canada is most afraid of. You see here in the mid to late 70s, we saw this sort of increase in inflation and then a decrease in inflation when the Bank of Canada raised interest rates to try to sort of rein in this inflation. But then we saw inflation, well, it wasn't actually solved. The Bank of Canada pumped the brakes too quickly and we saw inflation increase again, and they had to increase interest rates even more dramatically to get it under control because they didn't get it under control the first time. If you map that example to the experience we're seeing today, you can see why the Bank of Canada is so afraid of inflation becoming entrenched and why they might keep interest rates high for the long term here to make sure inflation goes away for good, because if they pump the brakes just like what happened in the mid to late 70s, well, they could just experience inflation again and have to raise interest rates even more, having an even more catastrophic economic impact. But that was looking at Pierre Elliott Trudeau in the time that he was in power. The story was higher government deficits and higher money supply growth led to higher inflation. But now let's take a look at how this maps to today's situation in terms of these indicators as it stands today. Now looking at the money supply growth in Canada during the time that Justin Trudeau has been in power, from 2015 all the way up until, well, today, we can see that there was also money supply growth over his term, going from $1.3 trillion roughly all the way up to $2.3 trillion, a 77% increase, less of an increase than Trudeau Sr. When we think in terms of percentages, but in terms of the total amount of money added, this is roughly $1 trillion added to the Canadian money supply during this period of time. Interesting to note, however, that the rate of money supply growth compared to the previous Conservative government when Trudeau came into power remained pretty constant until the pandemic, when things started to change. Now, when we look at Canada's government debt during this same period, again, it looks pretty similar to the previous chart we saw, a steady increases here and a dramatic boost in the amount of debt that the Canadian government has during these last couple of years throughout the pandemic. And the same goes for inflation. While it was under control during this first period since the beginning of the pandemic and the increasing of these deficits and the expansion of the money supply, well, we've seen inflation peak as well at 8% here. There's a common thread and a little bit of a correlation here. You can see that as money supply expands and as governments take on more debt and spend more money as a result of taking on more debt, well, we see inflation increase. And this also is represented in the interest rates that we see in the decisions of the Bank of Canada. You can see here back in the late 80s, early 90s, to deal with the lingering impacts of that inflation, well, interest rates were extremely high. And now we're seeing in 2022 to deal with inflation, interest rates are going to have to go up significantly, certainly as a percentage of what they were for a long period of time here. Seeing such a dramatic increase after such a long duration of low interest rates has a large impact. But how does this all play into Pierre Poilievre potentially firing the governor of the Bank of Canada and those criticisms that he has of the Bank of Canada? Well, let's listen in and then we'll go into some more depth.
You'll notice that I actually haven't criticized Mr. Macklem for monetary policy. I've criticized him for fiscal policy, because I believe when he was printing money specifically to buy government bonds, he was engaging in fiscal policy, and that is not his job. I want a central bank governor that does monetary policy alone and leaves the fiscal policy to the elected officials who are accountable to the electorate.
There's a big emphasis here on monetary policy versus fiscal policy and who should be doing what. Monetary policy typically refers to the role of the Bank of Canada when they make financial decisions that will impact the overall Canadian economy outside of the jurisdiction of the fiscal policy that is created by politicians. That sort of refers to how they manage their finances and their debt policies for that individual government. The Bank of Canada and the Government of Canada are supposed to be separate entities. Poilievre's argument here is that the Bank of Canada stepped into the fiscal policy realm when they decided to take action with quantitative easing at the beginning of the pandemic, printing billions upon billions of dollars to buy up Government of Canada bonds, the debt instruments that the Government of Canada uses to raise money to spend. It seems Poilievre is saying, hey, Bank of Canada, maybe you shouldn't have done that money printing and supported the Government of Canada in such a way. That's a little bit too much of a political decision for his liking. Maybe you should have just stuck to making your interest rate decisions and changing the overnight rate to impact the economy instead of making this decision that enabled a particular government, the Liberal government, to implement the social programs that they did at the beginning of the pandemic, such as the CERB and other financial supports for the Canadian economy. But as a little bit of a thought experiment, what would have happened if Stephen Poloz, the previous governor of the Bank of Canada, and Tiff Macklem, the current governor of the Bank of Canada, refused to increase their balance sheet and engage in this quantitative easing program? What would have happened? Well, the reason that they did it in the first place was to make sure that we didn't enter an extremely deep recession at the beginning of the pandemic when everyone stopped going to work and stayed inside. People were worried that the entire Canadian economy could suffer severe scarring as a result of this economic black swan event. If the Bank of Canada didn't engage in this kind of economic stimulus by adding all of this money to the money supply, would it have been enough for them to just lower their overnight rate to 0.25%, which is what they had it at? Would that have been enough to stop this economic collapse and potentially a very large recession? And how does that relate to now? Is what we're going through now in the recession that we're currently in worse than what could have happened at the beginning of the pandemic? Well, we don't know what would have happened in that alternative reality where the Bank of Canada doesn't provide this fiscal stimulus, so we're just going to have to keep on wondering what would happen. But what we don't need to wonder about is what Poilievre believes is the solution to the current inflation crisis that we're seeing here in Canada.
What are we doing now? Well, Trudeau too is running consistent deficits that now even his central bank governor says are inflationary in nature. So the right policy, and the one that I would implement, is to bring the deficits down and in the process bring inflation down. And right now the cost of government is increasing the cost of living. The more they spend, the more things cost. We have to cap government spending and cut government waste in order to bring down the inflation so that the higher interest rates are no longer necessary. That's the policy that I control. Monetary policy, it will be up to the independent central bank governor.
So here Poilievre is recognizing that what the Bank of Canada is doing to fight inflation by raising interest rates, well, that's having a negative impact on a lot of Canadians, raising mortgage costs as well as increased costs for any kind of debt because interest rates are higher. And it seems that he thinks that this isn't the only solution to inflation. This is dealing with the demand side, making people less likely to spend money, making them feel poor by raising these interest rates. That means less people will spend in the economy, reducing inflation. That's what the Bank of Canada is going for. But Poilievre is saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't just look on the demand side, maybe we should look on the supply side. We've seen government spending impact inflation in the past, as we took a look at in those previous charts. So maybe if we decrease government spending, we can actually reduce inflation and not need as drastically high interest rates to bring down inflation. Instead, we can look at this other option. But this would mean a lot less government spending, and that sort of sounds good as an idea, but then when you consider how that might be achieved, then you start to get some additional concerns. Of course, in a best case scenario, you could reduce government spending by eliminating waste and inefficiency within the government without having to cut any of the services and programs that many Canadians deem necessary or view as necessary. But is that going to be enough just by cutting that inefficiency and cutting that waste in government? Or in order to actually bring inflation down and to reduce government deficits enough, would we have to cut social programs that many see as a net positive here in Canada? Is that the way that we'd have to go in order to reduce spending? And we can make predictions all we want about what any future government might do, but we don't really know what their plan is until we see budgets from any future government or even the current government right now. Where are they going to find this extra money? And is that going to be enough of a reduction to fight inflation, even if we lower interest rates? But either way, the current governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem, is in hot water right now because he's got two negatives on his hands, right? He's having to keep interest rates extremely high while Canadians are still feeling the impacts of inflation. So we've got inflation making things less affordable, and we've got high interest rates making things less affordable. And he's actually sort of acknowledged that, hey, maybe we didn't manage things as best we could during the pandemic. I made a full video on his final speech of 2022, which is the most revealing speech that I've heard from the governor of the Bank of Canada. So you can check out that video here if you haven't already seen that. But I'm curious what you think about all of this. Do you think that the road to solving the inflation problem is to reduce government spending? And where do you think we can cut funds from government spending in order to reduce that government spending? Let me know down below. Or do you think that it should be an entirely different direction and that the interest rate policy of the Bank of Canada right now is the way to go? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one and try to get back to a bunch of them. And if you haven't already done so, make sure to subscribe to the channel to keep on getting Canadian-focused financial updates just like this one. And with all that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.